The congregation knew before he said a word. That is the thing that every survivor describes and that no account of Jonestown has ever fully explained. Before Jones reached the microphone, before he opened his mouth, before a single word left his body, the people who had been with him long enough could read what was coming from the way he walked toward the stage. The pace, the set of the shoulders, the particular angle of the head. These were not subtle signals that required interpretation. They were, after months or years of exposure, as legible as weather. A fast walk meant energy, which could mean generosity or could mean danger, and the difference between those two things would not become clear until the first word. A slow walk meant something had happened, or was about to happen, or that Jones had decided something that the congregation would not learn until he was ready to tell them. And a very specific walk. Unhurried, almost ceremonial, with a quality of stillness in the upper body that did not match the movement of the legs, meant the third thing. The thing that the long-term members recognized and that the newer members learned to recognize by watching the faces of the long-term members. It meant that tonight, the voice would be different. And when the voice was different in that particular way, everything that followed would be different too. Jim Jones had, by the accounts of every person who spent significant time inside People's Temple, at least 4 distinct vocal registers. Not performed voices, not theatrical choices made consciously for effect, though he was conscious of them and used them deliberately, but voices that emerged from different states, that corresponded to different internal conditions, and that the congregation learned to read with the precision of people whose safety depended on accurate reading. If you have ever wanted to understand how a voice alone, not words, not theology, not argument, can hold 900 people inside a system they cannot leave, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because the voice is where the control lived. Not in what Jones said, in how he sounded when he said it. The first voice was the preaching voice. This is the one most people know from the recordings. The one that appears in the early sermons, the Indianapolis years, the California years before the move to Guyana. It was warm and it was rhythmic and it had a quality of musicality that was not accidental. Jones had studied black church tradition extensively, had preached in black congregations from the beginning of his career, had absorbed the cadences and the structures and the particular relationship between preacher and congregation that the black church had developed over generations. The call and response, the building of emotional intensity through repetition and variation, the use of silence as punctuation, the way a voice can move a room toward a collective state that the room could not reach on its own. The preaching voice was, in the assessment of every musicologist and linguist who has studied the recordings, extraordinary. Not in the way that trained performers are extraordinary, not technically refined, not formally educated. In the way that natural instruments are extraordinary. In the way that a voice can be when the person carrying it has spent their entire life learning, intuitively and without formal instruction, how sound moves through bodies. The people who heard it in the early years describe a physical sensation, a feeling in the chest, a loosening of something that had been held tight. A researcher who studied the recordings said, "If you listen to the early sermons without knowing what came after, you hear someone who could have been one of the great preachers of the 20th century. The voice alone, just the voice." The second voice was the intimate voice. This is the one that fewer people have described publicly, because it was used in smaller settings. In the meetings with individual members, in the late-night conversations with inner circle figures, in the sessions where Jones addressed someone directly about their life, their struggles, their private pain. The intimate voice was quieter than the preaching voice and had an entirely different texture, slower, more deliberate, with long pauses that were not theatrical but genuinely searching, as if Jones were feeling his way towards something that required care to reach. The people who experienced this voice describe it consistently as the most dangerous of the 4. Not because it was frightening, it was not. Because it was the most difficult to resist. Because it was the voice that made you feel found. The preaching voice addressed the room. The intimate voice addressed you. Only you. It said, without saying it, that Jones had seen something in you specifically, had identified something that you had not expected anyone to identify, and was now speaking to it directly, carefully, as if the thing he had found were fragile and required delicacy. Former members who had left People's Temple and who could speak with clarity about the manipulation, who understood intellectually what Jones had done and why. These members, when asked about the intimate voice, consistently describe it as the thing they missed most. Not Jones, the voice, the feeling of being spoken to by it. The third voice was the warning voice. This is the one that appears most frequently in the Jonestown recordings, the late-night broadcasts, the white night assemblies, the addresses to the full community about the threats that were always approaching. It was neither warm nor quiet. It was controlled in a way that control itself becomes a threat, the voice of someone who has decided something and is now informing you of the decision rather than inviting you into it. The warning voice operated on a register that bypassed the cognitive entirely. It did not make arguments. It created states. A specific state, the state of a person who has been told that danger is present and imminent and that the only safety is here. With this voice, inside the perimeter it defines. Long-term members describe recognizing the warning voice in the first syllable, before a word, in the breath before the first word, in the quality of the silence before the breath. They describe their bodies responding before their minds did, a tightening, a narrowing of attention, a realignment of the self toward the source of the voice the way a plant realigns toward light. Not because they chose to, because the voice had trained them, over months and years of exposure, to respond that way. The warning voice was a conditioned stimulus. Jones had spent years conditioning the response. The fourth voice is the one that appears only in the final months in Jonestown, and only in a handful of recordings, and that researchers who have spent years with the material describe with a uniformity that suggests they are all encountering the same thing. It has no clean name. The closest any of them have come is the flat voice, though flat is not quite accurate. It is more that the voice has had something removed from it that was present in the other three, some quality of intention, some sense that the person speaking is oriented toward the listener, is producing the sound for someone. The flat voice sounds, in the recordings where it appears, like a voice that has forgotten it is being heard. That is speaking for internal reasons that have nothing to do with communication. Survivors who were present during the assemblies where the flat voice appeared described the effect it produced in the congregation as unlike anything the other three voices produced. Not fear, though fear was present. Not warmth, a specific and difficult sensation that several of them describe, independently, with the same word, dread. Not the dread of something coming, the dread of something that has already arrived and that you have only just recognized. A linguist named Sarah Okafor spent 4 years analyzing the Jonestown recordings for a doctoral dissertation that was completed in 2001 and that remains one of the most technically rigorous studies of Jones's vocal behavior ever conducted. She mapped the acoustic properties of the 4 registers, pitch, tempo, amplitude, spectral characteristics, and documented the transitions between them with a precision that the survivor testimony, which is qualitative rather than quantitative, cannot provide. Her findings confirmed what the survivors described but added a dimension that the survivor accounts had not captured. She found that the transitions between registers were not random and were not simply responsive to content. Jones did not shift to the warning voice because he was discussing a threat, and did not shift to the intimate voice because he was addressing someone personally. The transitions followed a pattern, a sequence, the same sequence, across different recordings, different years, different contexts. The preaching voice would move to the intimate voice, which would move to the warning voice, which would, not always, but in the recordings where the flat voice appears, move to the flat voice. It was a progression, a direction, as if the 4 voices were not independent registers but stages in something, a process that, once begun, moved in one direction. Okafor described the progression in her dissertation with the language of acoustic analysis and then, in the conclusion, with something that is not quite academic language but that she could not find academic language to replace. She wrote, "What the recordings document is not a speaker using different voices for different purposes. It is a speaker being moved through different states by something that the recordings cannot identify. The voice is not controlling the content. The content is being produced by whatever is controlling the voice. By the flat voice, in the final recordings, the content has become incidental. What is primary is the state that the voice is in and that the voice is producing in the room. And the state, in those final recordings, is one that I have spent 4 years trying to name accurately and that I can only describe, finally, as the state of someone who has arrived somewhere they cannot come back from. The voice knows this before the words do. The voice is always ahead of the words. That is the thing the recordings preserve that no other document does. Not what Jones said, what Jones was, before he said anything. In the breath, in the silence before the breath. There is one recording that Okafor describes at length and that she returned to more than any other during the 4 years of her research. It is not from the final days. It is from 1976, 2 years before Jonestown, from a service in San Francisco. Jones is in the preaching voice at the beginning, warm, rhythmic, the voice that the early recordings established as his primary register. 13 minutes in, without apparent cause, the voice shifts, not to the warning voice, which was the usual transition from the preaching register, to the intimate voice, but directed at no one, at the full congregation, hundreds of people, in a register that was built for one. The congregation goes quiet in a way that the recordings of their response to the preaching voice do not produce, not the charged quiet of a room being moved collectively toward something, a different quiet, the quiet of hundreds of people who have simultaneously felt something directed at them personally, who have, for a moment, each believed that the voice is speaking to them alone. Jones holds that register for approximately 90 seconds. Then he returns to the preaching voice and continues the service as if the transition had not occurred. The congregation recovers. The collective energy resumes. But Okafor, who has listened to that 90 seconds more times than she can count, describes it as the most instructive moment in the entire Jonestown archive. She writes, "In those 90 seconds, Jones demonstrates the complete mechanism. The preaching voice builds the collective state. The intimate voice dissolves the collective into individuals, each of whom believes they are being addressed personally. And then the preaching voice reassembles the collective, which is now composed of individuals who have each had a private experience of being seen, who have each felt, for 90 seconds, that the voice was for them. The collective that reassembles is not the same collective that existed before the 90 seconds. It is a collective of people who now have a private relationship with the voice, who now feel, each of them, that what Jones is saying in the preaching voice is addressed to them specifically, because they have evidence, 90 seconds of evidence, that the voice can find them, that it has found them, that it knows where they are. The recordings are in the archive. Okafor's dissertation is available through university library systems. The four voices are all present, all documentable, all analyzable with the tools that acoustic science provides. And yet the thing the recordings cannot provide, the thing that every researcher who has spent significant time with them eventually reports, is the experience of being in the room, of being in the body of someone for whom those voices were not a subject of academic analysis but the acoustic texture of daily life, of being trained, over months and years, to read the walk before the voice and the breath before the word and the silence before the breath, of living inside a system where the most important information was not what Jones said but how he sounded when he said it, where the voice was the weather and you would learn to read the weather because the weather could change, and when it changed everything changed with it. The survivors carry that reading with them. They carry it in the way that the body carries training that the mind has tried to set down, in the way that a person who has spent years inside a system of acoustic control still responds, decades later, to certain vocal qualities in certain combinations with a recognition that they cannot fully explain. Not memory, the body's memory, the thing the voice put there that the voice cannot take back. Jim Jones is dead. The recordings exist, and somewhere in the bodies of the people who survived him, the training continues. The voice is still there, still readable, still ahead of the words, still in the breath, still in the silence before the breath, still, after everything, doing what it was built to do. Okafor defended her dissertation in 2001. The committee praised the acoustic analysis and questioned the conclusion. The language of the final paragraphs was, several members noted, not the language of a linguist. It was the language of someone who had spent 4 years inside something and come out changed. Okafor revised the conclusion for publication. The published version is more restrained, more technical, but the original, preserved in the university archive, is, in the judgment of every researcher who has read both versions, more accurate. Not more rigorous, more accurate, because what Okafor was describing in those final paragraphs was not a finding, it was an experience. 4 years listening to a voice built to find you, and discovering, somewhere in the third year, that it had. She gave one interview about the dissertation, in 2004. She was asked whether, after 4 years of analysis, she understood how the voice had worked. She said, "I understand how it worked technically. I can show you the waveforms. I can point to the exact moment a register shifts and tell you what it produces in a listener's nervous system. What I cannot do is explain why it worked on me. I knew what it was. I knew what it was doing, and it still worked. I would be listening to a recording, analyzing it, and the voice would shift into the intimate register and I would feel it, before I processed it, before the analysis engaged. Just the body, responding, except I had not been trained. I had been studying, and somehow the studying had become training." She paused. Then she said, "That is the thing I could not put in the dissertation, that the voice does not require years of exposure to begin working. It requires attention. If you pay attention to it, it finds you. That is what it was built to do. That is what it does to everyone who pays enough attention to let it begin." The people in People's Temple from the beginning, who heard the voice in Indianapolis in the 1950s before the other registers had fully developed, described the original version consistently. They say it was different, more open, less controlled. The warmth was the same but the intention behind it was less legible. Jones in the early years was using the voice without fully understanding what it was doing. By the mid-1960s he understood. By California he had the technique and all 4 registers fully developed. By Jonestown he had the 4 registers and the pharmaceutical alteration and the paranoid distortion and the flat voice that appeared when everything else was stripped away. Only the instrument remaining, operating without the musician, producing the states it had been built to produce in a room full of people who could no longer imagine living anywhere else. The voice is on the tapes. The tapes are in the archive. You can find them. You can listen. And if you listen long enough, if you pay attention long enough to let the acoustic properties do what they were designed to do, Okafor's warning becomes relevant. The voice does not require years. It requires attention. It will find what it is looking for. It always did. In Indianapolis and California and Guyana, and in a dissertation office in 2001, and in every room where the recordings have been played by researchers who believed that understanding a mechanism protected them from it. The voice knows something that the analysis does not. It knows that the body is always ahead of the mind. That by the time you understand what is happening, it has already begun. That the training starts with the first listen. That the silence before the breath is already doing something. That Jim Jones, in whatever sense a dead man's voice can be present in a recording, is still in that archive, still in those tapes, still finding, still in the breath before the word, still, after everything, exactly where he always was, in the first syllable, in the breath before it, in the silence before the breath, waiting for someone to pay enough attention to let it begin.